Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to this episode of the Qarawiyyin Podcast. This is your host Sara and I'm joined with my two co-hosts from last time, Aisha and Noor. And we're actually also joined by another sister from the Qarawiyyin Project. Aisha A, how are you doing?
Alhamdulillah, Jazakallah khair for having me on this time, sisters. Must say I'm a little bit nervous. First time doing anything like this, but inshallah it's all will be all right. Please have patience with me if I mess up a couple times, but inshallah should be fine.
No, looking forward to it, inshallah. How are you doing, Noor?
Alhamdulillah, Sarah. All is well. Alhamdulillah, we are back with our second episode. Sorry, we know we've been late. We've been wanting to release our second episode a while ago.
Alhamdulillah. Aisha H, how are you doing? How have you been?
Alhamdulillah, yeah, not too bad. I think everybody's a bit serious today because of obviously the topic at hand. But I'm grateful that we were able to get together because we've been very busy, hence the gap from our first episode to our second. But I think that it's really important that we discuss our topic today, and alhamdulillah that we were all able to get together and do that.
Alhamdulillah, yeah, it has been a while since we recorded our first episode, but we have been consistently working on improving our audio quality and just trying to plan further for future podcast episodes. And we were actually planning on discussing this topic of populism, but incidentally, a few days ago, this incident occurred in Christchurch, New Zealand, where a white nationalist terrorist went to a masjid and murdered about 50 of our sisters and brothers during Jumu'ah prayer. We ask Allah to accept them all as shuhada, to have mercy on their souls, and we ask Allah to bring complete shifa and healing to all of those who are still healing from this in the hospital, all of the wounded, and to make this a means of expiation of all of their sins. So before we even get to talking about like this broader issue of populism, which leads to incidents like this happening, just generally speaking, none of us are based in New Zealand, but virtue of the modern world, like we're hyper connected through the internet, we see regular updates when things like this happen. So what were your guys' initial reactions and just your headspace since hearing about the incident?
I think for mine, it was actually shock. I woke up. As soon as I woke up, I saw the news because obviously of the time difference ahead. It had been several hours since the incident actually occurred, and they'd already established that 49 people had been killed. And subhanallah, that higher number in just one incident, I think that was really jarring, and it was quite paralyzing to think that something on this scale had happened. Part of my work is journalism, and I write a lot of stories on things going on in the Middle East. And obviously, when you're covering conflict and war zones, you have to get used to writing about death and seeing an ever-increasing death toll in many cases. But subhanallah, this was just a really different incident. Just because I think of the sheer brutality of it, the fact as well that this was filmed and, shared on social media and celebrated. This isn't a conflict zone. This isn't a war zone where these things, as horrible as they are, often do happen. You expect them in those circumstances. This was something entirely different in a place that is known to be one of the most peaceful places and tolerant places in the world. So on so many levels, it was just incredibly shocking. And I think that only now has really the shock sort of started to wear off. But for many days, you could really feel that the entire Muslim community around the world was in mourning.
I think, Aisha, I completely agree with what you're saying. And I think it echoes for a lot of our listeners and just Muslims around the world. When the news broke here in the UK, it was quite early in the morning. So I didn't get the chance actually to delve into all the news until I got home from work that evening. And I think it was all the details and just how deliberate and planned of an attack it was on a very peaceful Jumu'ah prayer is something that everybody can relate to, obviously. You know, it happens every Friday, like clockwork, around the world. And the fact that the gunman filmed it, that he went in, that he attacked not just men, but also went in for the women and children, I think these are just the really, really chilling details. I mean, the fact that he'd written an 87-page manifesto, this is not a crazy person. This is a very deliberate attack. And I think that was really, really terrifying to me.
I think for me, as it's for a lot of Muslims, it was a combination of frustration and disappointment. I mean, we were all, while we were like mourning for the deceased, we all felt disappointed in the world that this kind of thing happened and it didn't actually find the kind of coverage that it deserved. Apart from that, just as Aisha has mentioned, the fact that it happened in a mosque was the I think the most brutal side of it, because in any tradition, in any religion, places of worship are like sacred places. They are considered as sanctuaries even in the times of war. So as Muslims, we used to say this, like terrorism has no religion. So I think it makes sense. I think this actually is a great example of that, because in no religion you attack a mosque, or even in times of war there are like certain principles that you do not harm women and children and innocent and while they are in state of worship. Just basic humanitarian universal principles. I think we felt disappointed in the humanity, and especially in the modern world, where we think that as human beings we are progressing to be better humans, but obviously it's not the case.
Yeah, and that speaks to, I think, personally how I felt. On the one hand, it's shocking, but at the same time, and I think I agree with the sentiment that a lot of people have been sharing, which is that it's not unprecedented, that this is not some like random lone wolf attack, but that it's a continuation of the status quo of white supremacy and Islamophobia. So while it is extremely jarring, it's also, I don't know, I guess like a lot of people were not surprised to see it. And at least like, I'm not proud to say this, but I spent a lot of time like on social media just scrolling. I felt like I was looking for something, but I just like kept reading response after response. And I don't think that's the healthiest thing to do, but I think I was pleasantly surprised to see a lot of people were turning to the word of Allah, and a lot of people were sharing verses from the Quran and the words of the Prophet ﷺ, that spoke about, martyrdom. So I was happy to see that, but at the same time it's I don't know, like a lot of the circles that I'm in when it comes to like community spaces, we're also like messaging and being like, what do we do? How do we respond? And that showed me, it sucks to even say that we need a protocol, but we still have not developed like a protocol for how to respond to these things. Every time something like this happens, we're like, we scramble to figure out how to respond. And like, that's the worst time to figure out how to respond to something like this, because we're all like, our emotions are running on a high, and we don't want to act brashly. And then again, like I started thinking about like, okay, this happened. It's, like I'm trying to place it in the world of, like in this hyper-connected world where people have access to, like semi-automatic weapons, and Muslims are vulnerable. What do I do now? Like, what is my role in this? And I think that what I realize is that the most powerful tool at my disposal, is to recognize how powerless I am, and that all power lies in the hands of Allah. And because of that, that's not like a source of despair, but rather a source of comfort, because I know that I can ask Allah, and that Allah He answers every sincere dua. So that's like what I've been turning to as like my source of solace. And but speaking of, the fact that like we can, that we're able to see like a lot of media response from community leaders, politicians, on social media, on the internet. What are your guys' thoughts in general about the media response following the incident?
I mean, I think it was And I know this has been said before, but I think New Zealand's Prime Minister coming out and very quickly labelling it a terrorist attack, I think there was almost a sigh of relief that, yes, okay, the gunman wasn't a brown person or an Arab person or a bearded person, but, you know, at least we've had the decency for someone to go and call them a terrorist, because, I mean, that is what this attack was. I think it's, you know, you've had all the solidarity. To be honest, I've been in a little bit in two minds about the way that the media's portrayed this attack. On the one hand, yes, you've got people who are quickly coming out and saying, yes, this is terrorism, and, you know, not wanting to be like, look, you know, we call things other than, you know, Arab Muslim shooters terrorists too. But on the other hand, you've got the real hypocrisy of people like, for example, here in the UK, Boris Johnson saying things like, yes, you know, this is terrible, you know, that somebody's gone out and shot all these Muslims, and oh, how dare they, and why has this happened? And you're thinking, mate, literally not too long ago you're referring to our Niqabi sisters as letterboxes, and you're thinking that's not going to have an effect on, you know, what people think and how they react towards Muslims. Which in itself, to be honest, has been, you know, it's been really great at showing the hypocrisy of some of these people. And I'm not the only one who's picked up on this. I know a lot of my friends and a lot of people in my wider circle have picked up on this hypocrisy in the media of, on the one hand, they turn and they bow their heads and they say, I'm really sorry. But on the other hand, they spout all of this speech and rhetoric that is essentially what's fueled this gunman towards the actions that he's undertaken.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with everything, you know, you've said, Aisha. I think that for me as well, that was actually the thing that it was like, you know, it just made it all the worse that when you're already in a time of mourning and grief, it was really adding salt to the wound to then see people who contributed to this narrative coming out and condemning it from all over the world. Obviously, there was a very famous statement made from an Australian senator, Senator Fraser Anning, who condemned it whilst in exactly sort of the same breath, almost the same statement, almost blaming the victims for having come to New Zealand in the first place, thereby in some way bringing this attack upon themselves. But even people who didn't go to that extreme, it was just exceedingly frustrating seeing everybody from Donald Trump to people like Piers Morgan in the UK, who's a journalist that has normalised the rhetoric surrounding this incident that has ultimately led to something of this scale happening. And even though there has been general condemnation of the attack, there has still been differences in the way that reporting has gone on compared to how a Muslim terrorist would have been reported on. You can see even today there's many stories about how he was bullied as a child, and how, you know, he was bullied for being chubby and fat, and therefore this sent him on a downward spiral that eventually led him to commit mass murder.
Which they're even saying things like his dad had cancer, and I'm thinking, I work as a doctor. Just not relevant. Loads of people have cancer. They don't turn them into gunmen and shooters.
100%. And I think even sort of those subtleties, people picked up on that, and that was depressing to see. But at the same time, Sarah, as you were, I was scrolling through social media, and majority of my timeline after a while was just that, because I think people are very fed up with those double standards.
Yeah, as you said, Aisha, they're just like paying lip service while they're actually part of the problem, and not even the part of the problem, root cause of the problem. While a lot of people actually pick on Trump and other like far-right figures, there's this like African American Trump supporter in the U.S., Candace Owens, was that her name? That the mass murderer referred to as one of the people he looked up to and one of the most inspiring people for him. I think like how somebody does something like this, everybody has that questioning, while people have different answers. If you read far-right newspapers, he was an angelic boy who grew up to be a far-right mass killer because of video games, or he was a working class person, or he was just a low income neighborhood. You find all these excuses. But I think this is not only even a far right issue, it's something broader than that. It has to do with the continuous demonization of Muslims following 9/11 and the war on terror and the constant rhetoric that's fed by both left and right. And more recently, the white supremacist ideology laid out by likes of Steve Bannon. Actually, there are a lot of parallels between this 74-page manifesto of the mass murderer and Steve Bannon's kind of rhetoric about immigrants and how they are actually invaders. The attacker, the mass murderer, is also talking about a genocide going on against white people. And this is like it does not sound, unfortunately, unfamiliar to any of us because we got used to this kind of rhetoric about Muslims and immigrants and people of color. And then I think why these white supremacists are actually carrying out these attacks, given that people like Trump and there are like other far-right leaders are actually on the rise. They have their leaders in power. Why are they carrying out these attacks?
No, you're touching on a lot of different points. When people start talking about like how does this happen, what are the root issues, there sometimes is disagreement between like, is this like a very recent phenomenon? We're talking about like the election of Trump and much more recent elections of right-wing parties throughout Europe, even in India, or is this a much longer standing issue? And I think that there's truth to both. That anti-Muslim hatred and bigotry and white supremacy, like on a global scale, from even prior to like really the advent of imperialism, like we can go back to talking about like the Reconquista in the Iberian Peninsula and the expulsion of Muslims and Jews from Spain. Like that is, we can say that that's the root of this, and that this has like much deeper roots, but it develops with time, right? It develops differently after like Black nationalist movements during the Civil Rights Act. It develops differently after 9/11. So we have to like look at the deeper roots, but also look at, okay, more recently, how have these things developed? Because like white nationalism is not, it's not necessarily a recent phenomenon, but maybe the ability for somebody to take inspiration through the internet, through like internet forums, talking about like that, you know, like internet forums that have been spurred on and have really just gained a lot of audacity since the election of people like Donald Trump. That is a more recent manifestation of this. That is like what really leads somebody to like acquire like such like military grade weapons and like go commit and act like this. So when we're talking about like root issues, right? We bring up like this topic or this term that's like called populism, which is not exclusive to white nationalism, but is a good way to think about it. Can we first define that before we really get into like what it means in this context?
Yeah, Sada, I think you've touched on a really important point, that it is about finding the root issues. In terms of populism, I think actually there is an interesting speech that Noor sent to us in preparation for this episode that she found interesting, that we wanted to watch, which was Steve Bannon's speech in November at the Oxford Union. And he really went into defining populism as very much rooted in economic and political disenfranchisement of the white working class, at least in his reality, within the United States, but also something that he saw very much in Europe. And he credited these problems that had been created by the global financial system, is particularly after the 2008 financial crash, and a growing inequality and seeming a growing divide between the ruling elite and normal white working class people, as something that had contributed to the election of Donald Trump and the rise of the far right overall, because it was about getting in touch with people's what they wanted, or what at least they thought they wanted. And a very big aspect here is the illusion of taking back some level of control. And in the UK, people know this slogan very much because that is something associated with Brexit, that when people voted to leave the European Union, the Leave campaign operated under the slogan of take back control. And really this extension of populism, though, I think it is to an extent also defined by that, where people see invaders, or what we would otherwise just know as immigrants, people with different backgrounds, different culture, coming and settling in their countries, and they at the same time are having all of these economic and political grievances, and essentially the immigrants are being made as a scapegoat to which they feel that they are not assimilating or integrating into our culture, and therefore they refocus their efforts around re-establishing what Bannon at least calls civic nationalism. Yeah, he very much denounces this idea of an ethno-nationalism, which is obviously what people throw at the right and the far right, because that is obviously got connotations of racism. He rejects that, and he says no, that this is just a civic and economic nationalism. And in order to sort of, and accompanied with that is obviously taking control of borders, not letting certain people into the country who are not going to help. And it perpetuates obviously the same myth about migrants, you know, just utilising the economy or utilising the political system for their own gains, but not actually becoming part of the culture. But I think that really populism in itself, what I got from his speech was that it's a defence mechanism. Actually, it had very few specifics, little to offer in terms of economic or political governance, other than vague promises of you're going to be able to change your surroundings by taking back control. Really, I think that it's Trump and other manifestations of the right have normalised this narrative, but it is in its essence just very similar to what you see of the far right in terms of being very individualistic, based upon an ethnic nationalism. I think it's hard to differentiate the two.
Yeah, and when you mention how like the Trump administration like kind of utilize this rhetoric about like the disenfranchised white rural worker, what comes to mind for me is the invention of like race as a concept to begin with largely has roots in kind of the beginning of Atlantic slavery, like in what became the United States. The division between like black and white really began as a mission on behalf of slave owners, white slave owners who were wealthier, who controlled the population at large. What they saw was that an alliance was being formed between black slaves and the disenfranchised whites, who just saw each other on like class lines, right? Like that they were just like the impoverished of society. And the way that the wealthier white ruling class was able to separate those two and like kind of, you know, like use a divide and conquer strategy was to inculcate this concept of racial white supremacy. And like by drawing this divide between like the enslaved black population and poor whites, it kind of like they tried to give poor whites a sense of supremacy over black slaves, so that they would not ally with them. And that is like really how the concept of white supremacy developed, was to just like use it as a way to like almost appease like the impoverished white population by showing them, no, you're not actually like, you're not the bottom rung of society. Black folks are, you're actually better than them. And that like it creates like a divide, right? So I think that's important.
It's all reactionary.
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. And so that's why even like following the Trump election, when a lot of people were trying to analyze voting statistics about who was voting for Trump, and people were saying, you know, like his support came from this like poor white rural base. When you break down the statistics, you actually find that the average Trump voter's income was higher than that of like other candidates, and that a lot of this rhetoric is like actually, you know, it's empty rhetoric, and it creates like a victimization narrative, like you were talking about, that makes it seem like that white society is being invaded from the outside, right? And that now like they have to react and protect themselves against it, when really not only is that a myth in that like there isn't really the crime coming like from immigrant communities in the US, in Europe, and in places like Australia and New Zealand as well, that is made up, but also it's just ahistorical, and that it doesn't even talk about why immigration is occurring in the first place, and how it wasn't until like colonialism ravaged the homelands of people who are coming from immigrant societies that, you know, that people started leaving those societies and immigrating to wealthier, more developed nations. So that whole rhetoric really needs to be broken down, and we have to see like how populism is utilized to draw people in, and to like make people feel like they have to defend themselves against anything. Like you were talking about it as a defense mechanism, right?
Yeah, I mean, those are both, such profound insights, honestly. I was just going to add to that by saying it sort of ties into as well with the whole idea behind nationalism and patriotism. I mean, something that's based on the bond between people, based on geography and just locality. You need an external threat. You need some sort of cause for you all to fight and agree upon, to keep you all together, using to strengthen that bond. If everything's happy and dandy, you'll start turning in on yourself and looking for problems there. Whereas if there's an external threat to focus on, for example, the immigrants or the Muslims, then there you go. Let's all band together on this.
And it's also a great psychological trick, because human beings are emotional beings more than they are rational beings. You can tell people that their fears are irrational, or Muslims or immigrants are not invading their countries. Their numbers are a lot smaller and they're not posing threats to white people. But if the far-right media and these far-right figures are constantly eliciting fear, and using fear as a tool to control their constituencies and mobilize the masses, it's actually another level of awareness we need to address. And like, when we are actually addressing people, we should know that we should also appeal to their emotions, the positive emotions they have, rather than fear, but more like mercy and like what we have in common.
Yeah, and on the topic of just again trying to make sense of like where inspiration for these things happens and how populism develops to the point where people feel the need to defend themselves against some type of foreign invasion. Just using the New Zealand incident as an example, when we look at the perpetrator and the symbolism that he was invoking in his manifesto, which is like I don't know how many pages long, and also like even on the gun that he was using. There's a lot of symbolism on that, a lot of dates referring back to like past terrorist incidents, like connecting to even like the Bosnian genocide. So that to me was just like evidence of the fact that this is not an isolated incident, that it has precedent. And also it shows how populism is not bound by like national borders, right? That he's taking inspiration from like other countries, from incidents from before in history. So while like in some ways it's important to put these things like in their context, in their national context, there's also like very much an international, a global nature to this issue.
Yeah, definitely. I think that what we've really seen in this incident is the brutal marriage of populism and Islamophobia, because obviously populism in itself could be against multiple minorities, as you said. You know, particularly if it's rooted in white supremacy, it's against people of all ethnic backgrounds. It's inherently racist. But what we've seen here is a particular focus on Muslims, and his manifesto was very much specifying Muslims and Islam as the greatest threat. And as you said, had reference to other incidents in history that involved Muslims, not just things even like the Bosnian genocide, but even revenge against the Ottoman Empire for various campaigns that they had conducted. And I think that we can't underestimate these links, because that is, going back to what Nora was saying earlier, the product of the war on terror as well, in creating that image of Muslims and Islam as an existential threat that, when coupled with this rise in populism that we're seeing across the world, results in that specific targeting of Muslims and at a Muslim place of worship. They didn't just go to a Muslim area or, you know, a shop with a lot of Muslims in it, or target hijabi women. They went to a mosque because that is the most obvious symbol of Muslims in the West in this day and age. So it's definitely something that, you're right, Sada, you know, we need to be aware of and link it all up, because there are people who would play down this link, but we need to show that it's coordinated.
So now that we try to make sense of this situation and others like it and look at the root issues, what do we do next? Like, as Muslims, we can't be sitting ducks, obviously. Like, we have to tailor our response to this incident. But what do we do now?
I'm sure my two co-speakers can comment on this much more thoroughly, but I think initially what I've seen so far of the response has been quite reassuring in a way. So previously, when attacks have happened on Muslims or in the Muslim community, it's thoughts and prayers, it's let's give charity, it's all these very heartfelt but temporary sort of measures. Whereas this time I noticed a real difference in that people were talking about, you've got to look at the bigger picture. This wasn't just a one-off crazy man. This was, look at the effect the media has had. Look at the rhetoric since 2001, 9/11, what's, all the events that has led up to it. And I think, a lot of people that I saw, they were very good at isolating sort of causes, but I think one thing that I'd really love to discuss with you guys is solutions. So we've all found causes of why people like Tarrant has come out and done this horrific attack. But what can we do, or what is a solution for the Muslim community and the Muslim world at large for something like this to never happen again?
I don't know if it's like for us to think about the solution, because I don't think it's our fault. But what we can do to ensure that these type of things that don't happen to us could be just holding people accountable. Like, for example, a lot of times, like when, as far as the policing and surveillance goes, the states generally use, this includes the US, this includes other governments, they use their policing apparatus and their policing expenditures on Muslims. And why are they not? This guy was not even on any watch list or anything, and he, in his social media account, talked about actually his horrifying thoughts and taking them into action, and nobody did anything. And he was filming this live on Facebook for 17 minutes, and no algorithm whatsoever was able to detect and do anything about it. I think for us, the best thing we could do is hold people accountable and also be grateful to people who stand with us. And we know this woman in New Zealand who hid one of the wounded Muslims in her house. Probably she risked her life while doing that. And there are a lot of people who show support to Muslims. And we shouldn't be whom we criticize. Like, we should not make generalizations about white people or Christians or people in the West, because there are a lot of people who stand in solidarity with Muslims too.
Yeah, and Noor, you mentioned an important point about the policing apparatus, especially when it comes to short-term solutions and short-term reactions. A lot of Muslim communities are talking about increasing security at masajid. And this is something that, I think that we just need to be more cognizant of the fact that if you grow up Black in the United States, you don't grow up thinking that that you can, you don't call the police when you need help. The police are not a source of safety. You don't see them as a source of protection. So when a lot of masajid are thinking about calling local police in order to increase security, while I completely understand why people see that as a source of security and protection, it's not a source of safety for everybody. And that's really why this is one of those places where we have to hear out people's individual experiences. And I can't speak for the Black community and their experiences. You have to hear them out, because otherwise, if you grow up thinking that I can call 911, I can go to the cop at the mall if somebody harasses me or whatever, then your automatic reaction to one of these incidents is going to be, yeah, we need to up security. But that's not an option for everybody. Then that's not a solution for everybody. And I'm not super knowledgeable about this issue of security, but I do think that there is at least a conversation to be had about private security and about training our own community members to be able to protect our communities, and talking about self-defense. I think some Muslims are allergic to talking about that because they think that that's militant rhetoric, or talking about defending ourselves. That's not, because we don't talk about that because we enjoy that we don't want to have to defend ourselves in any situation, and we don't violence is not glorified in the Islamic tradition, but it's part of the sunnah to be able to defend ourselves because we have a responsibility to our community. So that conversation has to be had in a way that's serious, in a way that we can't just sit around and be afraid of talking about self-defense. Every community organization, every church, every synagogue has some form of security, and Muslim communities should be doing the same thing. And while we're having that conversation about security, we also have to be cognizant of how different segments of our community, what relationship they have to the police apparatus, to the militarized state.
I think obviously in terms of practical first steps, obviously if there are crazy gunmen and copycat people out there, then yes, I agree. You should do what you can to try protect yourself against this threat that now, though we've been talking about it for ages, is manifested in the most horrible way. But I do think it's important to remember, especially in these rather terrifying times, as we do whenever there's an attack against Muslims, that Allah is ultimately the best protector. And, you know, I think this ties in with something that really gave me a lot of solace when initially I heard about the attack, and I know a lot of other Muslims felt this as well, that subhanAllah, you know, these people died as martyrs, inshallah. Like, you know, that, you know, although, you know, as Muslims, we shouldn't fear death, really. We don't fear death, because we know that if you've lived a good life, then, you know, inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. To him we belong and to him we return. And so whilst it is pertinent that we do look for and try to protect ourselves as best we can, ultimately, you know, our lives are in the hands of Allah, and we should seek protection in him first.
Yeah, very true. And we understand that, like, we belong to Allah, to him we'll return, and that Allah's will is what conducts this world, and at the same time Allah has ordered us to enjoin good and forbid wrong, and he has told us in the Quran that Allah doesn't help a people until they help themselves. So that, like, we can reconcile those two things, right? Like having tawakkul and reliance on Allah, and also being responsible for our own actions. And a sentiment that I've seen shared following the New Zealand incident is this idea that, like, we Muslims globally, and I hate to say it, but, like, on the international stage, the blood of Muslims is cheap. There's nobody who there's no political entity that defends Muslims, that stands for the ummah, that represents us on the international scale. Things like this can happen because, like, we don't have backup in like a meaningful way, right? And so a lot of people have been saying that, you know, if we had like a Muslim state, we can call it a khilafa, or like just some sort of like representative entity, like we would be able to protect Muslims globally, and that's what we should work for. And I understand that, and something that, in order to understand what is like the role of this, like having a political entity, what I found really helpful was Sheikh Hamza Maqbool, actually, like, he records a lot of his talks on SoundCloud. And a few weeks ago was the anniversary of the abolishment of the Ottoman Caliphate. And he mentioned something in that talk that was really profound. And he said that, you know, we understand that we have this like fard kifaya, this communal obligation to exact the hukm of Allah on the political stage, right? To have khilafah. But at the same time, like, when khilafah is not being actualized externally, when there isn't a state, the khilafah of the individual, internal khilafah as he puts it, meaning like Allah tells us also that, like, here we are khulafa on this ard, that we are vicegerents of Islam on this earth, that never ends. Like, the caliphate, sure, that's abolished, but individual responsibility to carry Islam never ends. And also, when people talk about, like, looking towards like political self-determination and khilafah as a solution, like, we really have to ask ourselves, are we acting like khulafa? Do we conduct our local communities in a way, like, are we able to organize ourselves politically on a much smaller level? And I think that really it begins with this like internal individual purification and understanding our individual obligations. And this is not to discourage people from like seeking community organizing efforts or seeking to like acquire political power. Those things are important, but there's like a level of, there's an order of priorities. And I find it ironic when people talk about how we need to organize politically when they're like much more immediate personal obligations. And yeah, that includes salah. It starts with prayer. It starts with dhikr. If those are not being fulfilled, like, how do we think that we're going to be able to organize politically? And I think that we're in no place to judge people's individual practice of their deen, but we have to be real with ourselves to begin with. Like, if we really want to seek meaningful political self-determination, then we have to be real with ourselves on an individual level. Am I fulfilling my bare minimum obligations that I'm going to be immediately accountable for in the akhirah before I start thinking about like communal obligations? At the same time, we realize that, like, we have our fard ayn, we have to make sure we're fulfilling that, but also the fard kifaya, the communal obligation, it's not on like a couple people in the community to fulfill that. If the fard kifaya is not being fulfilled, everybody in the community is sinful, right? So we all have to be thinking about that. But yeah, it does start with just questioning ourselves and thinking, like, are we acting like khulafa?
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. I really agree with so much of what you said, and I'm really glad you brought up this angle to look at it, because I think that if we need to learn anything from the events of the past few days, it's to recognise that condemnations are not enough. Already we're seeing at the time of us recording this podcast that there is an attack that has happened in Holland, and as yet we do not know the motivation for that attack. We do not know the perpetrators, whether he was influenced by his religious or his ethnic background, or whether it was just a lone wolf incident or he was mentally disturbed. We don't know that right now, but we can already see the way in which the media is treating this as perhaps something in revenge for New Zealand attack. Is there some kind of link to ISIS? And everything that Muslims have been saying over the past few days about Islamophobia and the narrative about Muslims in the media has gone out of the window, and we're back to the same old standard strategy. So I think that if anything, we have to realise that we can't spend our lives just correcting the media. You know, it's never going to be enough. And this draws even more attention to the fact that having a representative Muslim voice on that global stage, and a political voice in the form of something like a khilafah, as you're saying, is incredibly important. And to be honest, I actually see the benefits of this in, well, when we look at a comparison, which may be an odd comparison for some people to think about, but the comparison of Israel, where obviously anti-Semitism is a big problem in many European states, and recently where there have been incidents of anti-Semitism, the Israeli Prime Minister has actually come out and condemned those instances and has called on European officials to do more, and he's put pressure on governments to define exactly what anti-Semitism is, such that people can be prosecuted for it, to make very strong statements against it, to clamp down on people having a certain narrative about Jewish minorities in these countries. And this is an influence and power that we as Muslims, we don't have, because we don't have that political representation. As to the issue of us, obviously, not neglecting our other individual obligations and recognising our own personal roles as khulafa, that is definitely something that should be at the forefront of our minds. But I think the same way that we wouldn't advocate for someone to only fast in Ramadan or only give charity once they've perfected their salah, we should equally recognise that this is an obligation that we must work towards in the present also, because as you said, this is a fard kifaya, it is a communal obligation. So they're joint fara'id, they're joint obligations, they complement one another. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah Ra'd verse 11 that, verily I will not change the condition of a people until they change what is within themselves. And I think that this speaks to us on both an individual level, as you were mentioning, but also Allah addresses us as qawm, as a collective group of people in this ayah. So ultimately, if we as a collective do not envision, do not demand, and do not seek change as a community and as a global ummah, then Allah is telling us we're not going to see that in reality. He will not aid us in our vision in that respect. So I'm really glad that you addressed this, alhamdulillah, and I feel like it's a topic that we might come back to, but it's definitely something worth mentioning in regards to this conversation.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. And I think we want to bring this episode to a close. I think we've addressed a lot of just the different angles from which at least we understand like the roots of an incident like the one in Christchurch, and also like what are we supposed to do in the follow-up to that. One last thing that I do want to mention, I was talking to my dad about like what had happened, and he mentioned to me the fact that like the people who were killed in this incident are shuhada, like they're martyrs in the sight of Allah. And I hope everyone recognizes that when you see the pictures of these people shared on social media, you're looking into the faces of people who have been honored by Allah. And we are not worried about them. Like we know that they are like with their Lord now, but we are worried. We should remain worried about ourselves, because we're still alive in this dunya. We're still being tested. We're still going to be held accountable for our actions. So really to be concerned about our own actions. And something that really beautiful that my dad mentioned when we were talking about this was actually that Sayyidina Umar ibn al-Khattab, when he was serving as the caliph, he would make this dua And people considered it like a kind of a strange dua because he would ask that Allah would make him a martyr. And he also asked Allah to take his life in the city of the Prophet ﷺ, in Medina. And this was weird because, Medina was in the hands of the Muslims. There was no really opportunity for jihad or warfare in Medina or in the surrounding areas. So to hope to die as a martyr there was like kind of a strange dua. But as we know, Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anh, he did die as a martyr in the masjid of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And we know that Allah answers our du'as. So as we continue to think about our personal obligations and our response to these things, we turn to Allah, we seek refuge in Him, and we ask Allah to grant us the best of endings. With that, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up this episode. Please check the description of the podcast for the link to the launch good. People globally have been raising money for the Christchurch community. So please make sure to check that out. Donate what you can and share it in your circles. Continue to make dua for the community and for our ummah globally, really. Stay tuned for future episodes from us. We hope to continue communicating with all of you on social media in future episodes. You can keep up with all of our regular publications on our main website, which is qarawiyyinproject.co. And we're on Facebook, just at the Qarawiyyin Project. And our Twitter handle is Qarawiyyin Proj. That's Qarawiyyin Proj. Keep up with us, talk to us, and keep us in your du'as. Jazakumullahu khairan for listening. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.